A Nice Cup of Tea by George Orwell, interpreted by Faran Whyde. If you look up tea in the first cookery book which comes to hand, you will probably find that it passes completely unmentioned. Or, at the most, you might find a few sketchy lines of instructions, which actually give no ruling at all on several of the most important points about how to make tea. This is very curious, not only because tea is one of the mainstays of civilization in Britain as well as Ireland, Australia and New Zealand, but because the best way of making tea can be the subject of violent disputes. So, when I look through my own recipe, for example, for making the perfect cup of tea, I find no fewer than 11 important points, which really should have been addressed in these books. But on maybe 2 of my 11 points, there would be pretty general agreement. However, at least 4 other points of mine are acutely controversial. Anyway, here are my own 11 rules for making tea, and every one of these I regard as golden. First of all, one should use Indian or Ceylonese tea, Sri Lankan tea, that is. China tea does have virtues which are not to be looked down on. It is economical and one can drink it without milk, but I find there is less stimulation in it. Whereas if I want to feel wiser, braver or more optimistic, I will drink my Indian tea. Or Ceylonese. Anyone who has used the comforting phrase, a nice cup of tea, surely means invariably Indian tea. Second, tea should be made in small quantities, so that means in a teapot. Tea made in a large urn is always tasteless, and army tea, which is made in a cauldron, is even worse. It does have a taste. It tastes of grease and whitewash. The teapot that you do use, then, should be one made of china or earthenware. Silver or Britannia-ware teapots produce inferior tea, and enamel pots are worse. Curiously enough, a pewter teapot, a rarity nowadays, is not so bad. So, third, this teapot should be warmed before making the tea. This is best done by placing it on the hob rather than by the usual method of swilling it out with hot water. Fourth, the tea when made should be strong. For a pot which holds 1 quart, if you are going to fill it nearly to the brim, 6 heaped teaspoons should be about right. Fifthly, the tea should be put straight into the pot. No strainers, no muslin bags or other devices must be used to imprison the tea. Now, in some countries, because the tea is loose in the pot, the teapots come fitted with strange, loose, dangling baskets under the spout, which are to catch stray tea leaves. Those are supposed to be harmful. Actually, they aren't. One can swallow tea leaves in considerable quantities with no ill effect. And anyway, if the tea is not loose in the pot, it never infuses properly, so it must be left loose. Sixthly, one should take the teapot to the kettle and not the other way about. The reason is the water should be actually boiling at the moment of impact on the tea, and that means one should keep the kettle on the flame while one pours. Some people add to this that one should only use water that has been freshly brought to the boil, but I for one have never noticed any difference. So there's no need for that in my view. Seventhly, after making the tea, one should stir it. Better, one should give the pot a good shake. Afterwards, allow the tea leaves to settle, assuming you don't want to drink lots of them. Eighthly, one should drink one's tea out of a good breakfast cup. So this is the large cylindrical cup, not the flat shallow type. The breakfast cup holds more tea, you see, and with the other kind, one's tea will often become half cold before one has well started on drinking it. Ninthly, one should pour the cream off the milk, if indeed the milk is still of the older type which has separable cream. It's important to be careful about this because milk which is too creamy gives tea a sickly taste. Be especially careful, if you are in the United States of America, to not use milk which is labelled half and half. One might mistake this for half-skimmed milk that, if well homogenized, could safely be used for making tea, but in fact half and half means half milk and half cream. It's quite inappropriate for making tea. It will give the sickly taste. Tenthly, one should pour tea into the cup first. Now this is probably one of the most controversial points of all, and indeed in every family in Britain there are probably two schools of thought on this subject. The milk first school can bring forth some pretty strong arguments, but I maintain that my own argument of tea first is unanswerable. My argument is that by putting the tea in first and then stirring as one pours, one can exactly regulate the amount of milk, whereas one is liable to put in too much milk if one does it the other way around. Lastly, tea, unless one is drinking in the Russian style, must be drunk without sugar. Now, I know very well that I have some opposition on this point, but nonetheless, how can you call yourself a true lover of tea if you destroy its flavour by adding sugar? It would be no more reasonable, I have to say, to add salt or pepper. You see, tea is meant to be bitter, just as beer is meant to be bitter. If you sweeten it, you are no longer tasting the tea, you are merely tasting the sugar. You could make a very similar drink by dissolving sugar into plain hot water. Some people would answer that and say they don't like the tea in itself, and they only drink it in order to be warmed up and stimulated, but they need the sugar to take the taste away. To those misguided people, I would say, try drinking tea without sugar for, say, a fortnight. After that, I think it's very unlikely you will ever want to ruin your tea by sweetening it ever again. Now, these are not the only controversial points to arise in connection with tea, but I think they are sufficient to show how subtilized the whole business has become. There are more than my 11 points. There's mysterious social etiquette regarding the teapot, and regarding why is it vulgar to drink out of your saucer, for example. And there's much more which could be written about the subsidiary uses of tea leaves, such as telling fortunes, predicting the arrival of visitors, feeding the rabbit, healing burns, and surprisingly sweeping the carpet. Anyway, it really is worth paying attention to a couple of my details, such as the details about warming the pot and using water that is really boiling to make the tea. That way, one can make sure to obtain from your available supply of tea that you put into the pot the strongest and best quality, which the raw tea, properly handled, really ought to represent.